Hi, thanks so much for watching. I'm Taysa Brown. I'm the Provincial Silviculture Performance Assessment Specialist with the Forest Science Planning and Practices branch. In this video, I will explain how to use stratification to manage for broadleaf trees and non-timber values. I'm going to quickly set the context. We're living through a time with a lot of extremes and a lot of change. In BC, we had 3 of our worst fire seasons ever in the past 5 years. We also experienced record-breaking temperatures during the 2021 heat dome. That was then followed up by a horrific fall flooding season. And with climate change, these extreme events are likely to worsen. At the same time, BC has been dealing with numerous beetle outbreaks and their aftermath, declining moose populations, the old growth debate, and public opposition to herbicide use. We've also had legislative change with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and recent FERPA updates. So overall, there's a lot happening provincially. Given all that, we've been hearing repeatedly from specialists, First Nations, and the public that the status quo is no longer an option. 3 major consultations have indicated that the public wants a different approach to natural resource management, and that includes our management of broadleaf trees. Our status quo has promoted conifer management. It's involved the removal of broadleaf trees from our regenerating stands to ensure conifer seedling survival and to minimize conifer growth losses. However, there is now recognition that we could have even greater timber supply losses from continued catastrophic wildfires, insect outbreaks like the mountain pine beetle, and climate change if we don't create a diverse, resilient, and adapted landscape. And broadleaf trees play an important role in doing that. Given that, how can we start to maintain more broadleaf trees on the landscape within the existing legal framework? Here are some ideas categorized by job type. None of these options are innovative. They are all doable, but they aren't all being done, or maybe not all done together. In this video, I'm going to explain how surveyors and brushing contract managers can make a difference by applying FPPR 46.11. With time, I'm hoping to release more videos explaining these other options. So let's do a quick review of the Forest Practices and Planning Regulation, Section 46.11. First, I need to warn woodlot licensees that this presentation does not apply for them. Woodlots fall under the Woodlot License Planning and Practices Regulation, and there's no comparable wording. So there are 2 sections to FPPR 46.11. The first section requires you to meet the free-growing obligation on each hectare. The second section provides flexibility in meeting this requirement, as long as the obligation is met overall for the standards unit. There's a key difference between regeneration delay and free growing. 2A applies to regeneration delay and free growing, and it allows less than 1 hectare not satisfactorily restocked or not free growing patches. 2B applies to free growing. It allows stratifiable 1 to 2 hectare not free growing patches if they are less than 5% of the standards unit area. And just as a heads up, I will be using the bolded acronyms throughout this presentation. So given all those potential current options, why am I focusing on FPPR 46.11 and stratification? Well, it's about to be survey season and is probably the easiest option to start implementing immediately. I'm also releasing a new document on the subject. It's entitled Using Stratification to Achieve Non-Timber Values. It's meant to be a follow-up to the Forest Cover Stratification and Milestone Declaration document that was published 15 years ago. This new document and today's presentation are simply meant to bring attention back to FPPR 46.11 and maybe shift some people's perspectives on how it can be used. I want to show you how we can strategically prescribe vegetation management and use FPPR 46.11 proactively to achieve non-timber objectives. I will also provide more details on surveying and results reporting when using FPPR 46.11. I'm hoping your key takeaways will be that there's no expectation to remove all broadleaf trees or patches to favor conifer production. We are willing to accept lower free growing numbers if it will help achieve non-timber values. So please use FPPR 46.11 to maintain broadleaf trees where possible to achieve non-timber objectives, even when you are managing for timber. To effectively use FPPR 46.12, it does take a strong understanding of stratification, statistics, and sampling principles. For the next few slides, I'm going to review some of these basics since this presentation does become technical. These key concepts can be found in the BC Silviculture Survey Procedures Manual and the Forest Cover Stratification Milestone Declarations Report. They are both posted on the BC Silviculture Survey's website. All right, let's start off with the basics of stratification. Stratification is the process of defining and identifying populations with similar characteristics within an opening. It is the most critical step in the survey process because it helps increase sampling precision. There's a lot of reasons to stratify. Many of them are listed on the slide. In this picture, we can see an example of where stratification is needed based on species composition. Clearly, there are two distinct units. But for today, with FPPR 46.11, we are going to be focused on stalking status and stratification at the time of free-growing surveys. So if I'm going to be focused on stratifying at free-growing based on stalking status, we need to know what can impact stalking status. It's a little complicated because free-growing involves both a tree and stratum level assessment. Your well-spaced trees may not be free-growing due to vegetation competition criteria, forest health, or minimum heights. Together, they all impact stratum free-growing numbers. Then, at the stratum, you may or may not achieve free-growing status depending on your preferred and acceptable free-growing densities. Also, if your cannibal conifers exceed the maximum density threshold, then your free-growing status will also be impacted. Now back to stratification. There are two other key terms to understand: mappable and contiguous. We only stratify mappable areas. A mappable area is greater than 20 meters wide throughout its length. So in the images, stratum B is a brushy strip adjacent to the road, and it is greater than 20 meters throughout its length. But if it was less than 20 meters, then it would be dissolved and lumped in with stratum A. Some FSPs may include a different definition of mappable, so it's always very important to check before starting a new contract. It's also important to understand the definition of contiguous. If you have an NFG patch and it's less than 20 meters away from another NFG or NSR patch or strip, then they actually need to be lumped together. So that's what's happened here. And that combined area is then assessed to see if it meets stratifiable size. So D is a unique stratum. It is greater than 1 hectare in size. Next, a quick stats review. I'd highly encourage you to read the decision rule steps on pages 104 and 105 of the BC Silviculture Survey Procedures Manual. This is critical to understand because you will have some uncertain stalking decisions if you're pushing the use of 46.11. So you need to know what to do if your mean is greater than the minimum stalking standard, but your lower confidence limit is not. The steps are roughly summarized on a slide. You look at your sampling intensity and possibly your confidence interval and desired precision. You would also potentially need to complete additional plots, up to 1.5 plots per hectare. All right, now we'll get into FPPR 46.12 generally without a broadleaf focus. We'll start with 2A, not free-growing areas, which I'll call NFG, that are less than 20 meters through their length are not stratifiable because they are not mappable. Also, NFG areas that are less than a hectare are not stratifiable. Not stratifiable areas get combined with the surrounding free-growing stratum. These small areas are simply variations within the stratum. If your stats meet overall for the SU, you're fine. You can maintain these non-stratifiable NFG patches or strips. No intervention is required. You simply need to know the regulation and be confident in your survey and statistics. All right, so here's a quick example. I was flying this block doing recce to see if brushing was going to be needed before free growing. Clearly, I found a really thick patch of alder, obviously NFG given the height to brush ratios, but you know what, really small patch, less than a hectare, not stratifiable. So unless my stats don't meet for the whole SU, I don't need to worry about it. No treatment is required. We can maintain this alder and allow for more diversity within our stand. Now, if you leave non-stratifiable deciduous patches, the variability of the population realistically increases. When you have increased variability that can't be addressed with stratification, you need a higher sampling intensity and a more structured sample. So if you're applying 46.11.2a, you'll likely need a grid or vector sample to allow for statistical analysis. Depending on how many non-stratifiable patches you retain, basically depending on how much you push it, you might even need to max plot, which means sampling at 1.5 plots per hectare. But I hope that's viewed as a worthwhile expense, given the difference retaining more broadleaf trees can make long-term for diversity, wildlife, forest health, etc. Also, surveys are cheap, especially in comparison to brushing. With 46.11.2b, if the stocking standards meet overall for the standards unit, then you can have a single or multiple 1 to 2 hectare stratifiable non-free growing patch or patches as long as the combined stratifiable non-free growing area does not exceed 5% of the SU area. You cannot have a stratifiable NFG patch if the SU is less than 20 hectares due to the 5% limit. For these smaller SUs, just FPPR 46.11.2a would apply, which allows for areas less than 1 hectare or less than 20 meters wide. For SUs between 20 and 40 hectares, you can have a single stratifiable non-free growing patch, and its size depends on the SU size. Once you have an SU greater than 40 hectares, you can have multiple stratifiable patches. For example, if you have a 60 hectare SU, you can have 3 hectares total that's stratifiable and non-free growing, but it needs to be in less than 2 hectare polygons. So you could have two 1.5 hectare non-free growing polygons or a 1.9 and a 1.1 hectare non-free growing polygon. Lots more options when you have a bigger SU size. I do want to emphasize that the 5% limit is for the SU, not the NAR. So you could have a 100 hectare block with 6 standards units, all under 20 hectares. You wouldn't be allowed a single stratifiable non-free growing patch in the entire block. Whereas if the same 100 hectare area was managed as a single standards unit, you actually could have 5 hectares of stratifiable non-free growing area as long as each polygon was less than 2 hectares. If you maintain a stratifiable NFG patch or patches, you will be required to submit spatial and a forest cover update for the stratifiable NFG area. So during the survey, you need to map out these areas and collect survey data specific to them. For the stratifiable NFG stratum, you do not need to follow the normal 5 plots per stratum. You can use any number of plots that you deem necessary to accurately capture the silviculture and inventory label information. You can also use visual assessment if you'd like. So while you're going to need to use a structured plot sample for your free growing declaration if you're using FPPR 46.11 extensively, I do want to highlight the benefits of using a UAV or a drone during your stocking survey or free growing initial reconnaissance. It's an incredibly effective tool for mapping out treatment areas and doing stratification. It's way easier to stratify when you can actually see everything. You can much more quickly get a sense of the size and distribution of the NFG patches. You can also more comfortably and defensively use FPPR 46.11 to its fullest extent if you know the size of each NFG patch and show that you've done the analysis. Okay, so for results reporting, you need to submit a forest cover for the free growing stratum and the non-free growing stratifiable stratum. But your overall status for the SU is free growing due to FPPR 46.11. So when you submit both strata, they both get a stocking status of IMM. You also need to include the spatial and inventory and silviculture data for both strata. So despite the status being IMM, if the reported free growing density is less than the minimum stocking standard, the stratum does get pulled into our results auditing reports. So to help identify the strata as being actually free growing, I'd highly recommend entering a comment into the declaration. You can see an example on the slide saying meets 46.11. It would just help us pull these strata out of that audit report. All right, so with those basics covered, we are now going to start talking about how we can take advantage of 46.112 to retain more broadleaf trees. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that you can use 46.11 to retain broadleaf trees on every stratum because there may be other factors impacting your free growing status. All these factors need to be considered cumulatively for FPPR 46.112 since they all contribute to the 5% limit and your standards unit statistics. So you'd want to apply 46.112B on the not free growing areas that are hardest to fix. So for example, you could have 3 1 to 2 hectare not free growing patches in your standards unit. One is NFG due to root rot, one is NFG due to short heights, and one is NFG due to broadleaf trees. Despite being NFG for different reasons, their combined area would need to be less than 5% of SU. If it's greater, then an intervention is required. You would want to address the short heights and brush because they are relatively easy fixes and save 46.112B for the root rot area where it would be very difficult and costly to remedy at this late stage. So in this example, due to the other factors, you would not be able to retain a stratifiable broadleaf patch. Given you cannot always use 46.112 to retain broadleaf trees, when you can, do it. Okay, while we're thinking about prioritization, I want to quickly touch on FPPR 97.1. With 97.1, you can be relieved of your obligation even where it has not been fully met. It should not be used if the obligation can be considered fully met under FPPR 46.11. It should always be your first consideration. If you can meet free growing with 46.1, then make sure to submit spatial and forest cover information for both the free growing and non-free growing strata, though the overall SU is considered FG. If the obligation cannot be considered fully met under 46.1, only then should you consider 97.1. You then need to assess whether you've contributed to not meeting the requirement and whether an amendment or intervention is required, or if you've truly done everything practicable. So with that in mind, we now need to think about designing brushing treatments. If we have broadleafs across our entire SU, what area should we brush and what area or areas should we retain with broadleaf trees? Basically, where should we create no treatment zones? So I have a rough priority list. First, you always need to consider whether there are areas with broadleaf trees that would remain NFG even after brushing. Maybe this area has low stalking or forest health issues. If so, that's where you want to prioritize leaving a no treatment zone and using FPPR 46.112B. You also need to consider safety concerns. If there's an area where you need to apply a no work zone, then you'll need to prioritize those areas as well for 46.112B. Now, if that doesn't apply, then you should consider where broadleaf trees would have the most positive impact long term. So this is when you want to start to consider whether any areas within your cut block have special significance for non-timber objectives. For example, are there salt licks or calving grounds within your block? Are any areas used for edible or medicinal plant collecting? Are there any streams? Are there areas adjacent to timbered edges that are valuable for wildlife forage? Are there areas that could benefit from a visual buffer? And this could be to provide protection for wildlife or to address human visual concerns. Now, if you have internal retention patches and no other special features, you could also consider how to create connectivity through broadleaf tree retention from the internal patches to the outer timbered boundary. Now, these are just some random examples. They could vary greatly across the province. So to understand what non-timber values could be helped by the presence of broadleaf trees in your area, I'd strongly recommend speaking to regional subject matter experts and First Nations. If the above do not apply, if all areas would be free growing with brushing and there are no areas of special significance, You can then start to consider how to locate broadleaf retention areas to minimize conifer volume impact long term. So you might first want to consider if you have any borderline passing areas, areas with low conifer stalking. In these areas, it's appealing to retain the broadleaf trees to stabilize the soil, capture carbon, help with conifer pruning, etc. We could also look for any variations in site series. You'd be looking for areas where the broadleaf trees site index is lower than the conifer species. In those areas, the conifer trees are better able to compete and suffer lower volume losses. We'd also look for any variations in species diversity. Ideally, the broadleaf no treatment zone would overlap with a shade-tolerant conifer species. They might have growth losses, but not as large as shade-intolerant species, and they also have higher survival rates. We could also consider the spatial distribution of the broadleaf trees. If they are highly clumped, they end up competing with each other and with fewer conifer trees. So you end up with less conifer volume loss overall than when you have a random distribution of broadleaf trees. And just a special thanks to Kat Gunyon and Eleanor McWilliams for the modeling and these images. Now, if absolutely none of those other reasons apply, you can just make a safety or logistics decision. So are there any areas that you'd rather not brush due to increased safety hazard? A no work zone isn't applicable, but it still would be much slower work due to safety concerns like bluffs, gullies, or difficult access. All right, we're now going to move into some examples. Our first example is a cup-block on the coast with 2 standards units. There's extensive broadleaf infill across the cup-block, though it's too variable and low density to consider broadleaf stalking standards. As a result, both SUs will require brushing treatments. But we can try to retain some broadleaf trees to address non-timber objectives with the application of FPPR 46.11. So first we want to know our stand conditions. SU1 is the yellow area, and overall it has fantastic wall space stalking, good free growing heights, and there are no current forest health issues. Once the alder is removed, we will be good to go for free growing status. And overall, our stats are good enough that we should be able to have a 1 to 2 hectare stratifiable non-free growing broadleaf patch and some non-stratifiable strips. So we have a good amount of flexibility. Now, it's important to note we do have one area with some lower conifer stalking due to heavy elk usage. There's a lot of elk beds for this area, and it likely wouldn't meet free growing even if brushed due to low well space stalking. SU2 is the purple area, and it has had very heavy elk use. So well space stalking is low despite numerous replants. There's luckily no current forest health issues, and the heights are above minimums. We will need all the well space trees to be counted as free growing to comfortably meet the stalking standards. That means we're going to need to brush the whole area. We won't be able to retain a stratifiable patch and still meet statistics. However, realistically, we can still retain a fair amount of broadleaf trees within the interspersed gaps in conifer stalking. So we'd want to use a ground-based selective brushing treatment to allow for that greater brushing precision. Next, we need to think about our non-timber values. So what do we have? We have several fish streams, S2, S3, several S4s just outside of the block. We also have 4 non-fish streams connecting directly into the fish streams within our block. We have several internal retention patches that are meant to provide structural diversity and forest influence. We also have a sizable wildlife tree retention area on the edge of the block. Then, as previously stated, we have an area with continued heavy elk use in the lower portion of the block adjacent to the WTRA. There are many bedding sites in this area, and this area also gets used for calving in the spring. All right, here's the plan. We are not going to brush the pink areas. They will be our broadleaf retention areas, or if you want to call them no treatment zones, that also works. We will overlap the stratifiable non-free growing polygon right here, stratum C, with the low well space density area. This will minimize the impact on long-term conifer volumes, given it already has low density, and at the same time, it will provide important cover and forage for the elk. We will also keep non-mappable, non-stratifiable strips along the streams and between the retention patches and the outer block boundary. This helps create connectivity and corridors for wildlife. Here we have the exact breakdown. Like I already mentioned, stratum C is stratifiable and overlaps with SU1. It's 1.8 hectares, which is exactly 4.8% of SU1. That's allowed given the size of SU1. All other no treatment zones are less than 1 hectare or less than 20 meters wide, so they are not stratifiable. These non-stratifiable areas do not add up and contribute to the 5% limit. Given the expected stats on this block, I would then schedule a plot free growing survey in 2 years. If the stats meet overall, I would then retain stratum C. I would lightly survey stratum C to create a silviculture in an inventory label. To results for SU1's forest cover update, I'd report strata A and C. I would not need to report D, E, F, or G because they are not stratifiable. They would not normally be split out. They are captured within A. I'd also report SU2. The broadleaf leaf areas in SU2 are all non-stratifiable, so they all get lumped together. I'm going to run through 2 more quick examples. For this one, we have a 46.4 hectare standards unit. Stats meet, our LCL is greater than the minimum stocking standard. We do have a 2.2 hectare NFG patch due to aspen. It's less than 5% of the SU area, so that's okay. But based on FPPR 46.11, we're only allowed an NFG patch up to 2 hectares in size, 1 to 2 hectares, and this is 2.2. As a result, to meet free growing, we would need to brush at least 0.2 hectares. We would not need to brush the entire aspen patch. Now, logistically, I fully recognize that brushing 0.2 hectares is annoying, but hopefully you can combine it with some other project in the area. For reporting, you would need to submit spatial and a silviculture and inventory label for both stratum A and B. You could determine the forest cover for B using any number of plots or a visual assessment. All right, final example. We now have a 40 hectare standards unit. There are several small NFG patches, all for a variety of reasons. They're each less than 1 hectare, so they are all deemed to be non-stratifiable. Since they are non-stratifiable, their cumulative area does not matter. There's also no 5% limit with respect to non-stratifiable NFG area. Since they are simply a variation within the SU, you would not normally map them out. You'd survey everything together and do stats for the entire SU. If your stats meet, you can then retain the non-free growing patches, and you would simply report a silviculture and an inventory label for SU1. In summary, broadleaf species have many non-timber values. There's a lot of benefits to retaining broadleaf trees in our stance. The government is willing to accept lower free-growing densities within the limits of the stocking standards and FPPR 46.11 to retain more broadleaf trees. So please feel free using FPPR 46.12 to retain broadleaf patches and strips. I hope you do this in a strategic way to maximize the benefits to non-timber values or to minimize the impacts long-term to conifer volumes. After this presentation, if you feel like you need more training on statistics, stratification, or sampling principles, I'd highly recommend doing a course with one of our provincial trainers. Their standard spring course dates are listed on this slide. They are all open to other course subjects and dates if there's adequate interest, so feel free to reach out to them. This table is also posted on the survey's website. It will be updated prior to the fall when there's generally more training courses and exam dates. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out directly to me. My email is listed on the slide, and please check out the new stratification document for more information.